the sound that saved Ella Fitzgerald's life in 1957 was nothing compared to the sound that broke her heart in 1962. After 3 days of silence and 8 failed attempts, the thin, foreign sound of Marilyn Monroe's voice finally crossed the ocean, but it sounded like a ghost calling for the very last time. The music hit like a thunderclap, a wave of pure, triumphant jazz washing over the tiny, exclusive Mocambo nightclub in 1957. That sound was Ella Fitzgerald finally singing to a packed, integrated room in Hollywood. But the only applause Ella truly cared about belonged to one beautiful, vulnerable woman sitting front and center every single night, Marilyn Monroe. Fast forward 5 years to the oppressive, sun-drenched summer of 1962. Ella Fitzgerald was soaring, the undisputed queen of jazz traveling the world, her voice a balm to millions. Yet, high above the roaring crowds, Ella carried a quiet, unspoken debt. That debt belonged entirely to Marilyn, who was now alone, fragile, and retreating deeper into the shadows of her Brentwood home. The world saw Marilyn as a glamorous movie star, but Ella saw her as the brave, kind-hearted soul who risked everything on that legendary night. The owner of the Mocambo had refused Ella Fitzgerald a booking. His reason was simple, rooted in the ugly prejudice that stained Hollywood at the time. His clientele, he claimed, were not ready. The door was closed. Then Marilyn, who adored Ella's voice, intervened. She didn't send a note. She didn't send a representative. She called the owner herself. She fought for Ella, promising to attend every single performance, bringing the biggest, brightest flashbulbs and the most famous columnists in Hollywood with her. For the Mocambo, that kind of guaranteed global press coverage was impossible to refuse. Marilyn forced the door open with the sheer power of her celebrity, all for a woman who was a friend in spirit, not in the spotlight. And Marilyn showed up just as she promised. Night after night, the biggest star in the world sat in the first booth, ignoring the whispers and the flashbulbs, listening only to the miraculous sound of Ella's voice. It wasn't just a powerful act of justice, it was a deeply personal one. Marilyn didn't help Ella because it was the right thing to do. She did it because she felt an immense kinship with another woman who was also fighting to be taken seriously in a world that only valued her service. Their friendship was not the kind you saw on magazine covers. They rarely spoke, rarely shared a meal. It was a soulful, almost psychic bond built on that one brave promise. Ella knew that Marilyn had given her the legitimacy and financial freedom to escape the grind, a gift that went beyond money or fame. It was the gift of a public future. In return, Ella always held a quiet space in her heart for Marilyn, a space reserved for the woman who understood the high cost of being seen. In the early, anxious days of August, as Ella listened to the sound of her own record playing on the radio in a foreign city, a chill crept through her. She had heard the whispers about Marilyn's escalating emotional turmoil, the canceled projects, the increasing isolation. Ella had paid the debt of the Mocambo with fame and success, but she feared that the fragile soul who had made it all possible was slipping away. That debt of the heart, the one that transcended celebrity, felt vast and terrifyingly unpaid. Ella suddenly knew, with the awful certainty of premonition, that she had to reach out to her friend. She had to try and return the favor before the silence became permanent. The distance separating them seemed to stretch across the ocean, but the memory of Marilyn's selfless kindness burned bright. Ella felt the urgent, irresistible need to hear that voice, the one she had saved, before it was too late. The calendar flipped to the final days of July 1962, but for Ella Fitzgerald, currently performing in an elegant Parisian theater, the summer air felt cold and wrong. An escalating, agonizing dread had settled in her heart, a specific chilling intuition that cut through the thunderous applause every night. She knew, with the certainty only deep connection provides, that the beautiful woman who had once saved her career was now in terrible peril. Marilyn, meanwhile, was experiencing the kind of intense isolation that fame often breeds. Her home was supposed to be a sanctuary, a quiet place of new beginnings, but it had become a gilded prison. She made fleeting, almost desperate attempts to reach out, a call to a doctor, a hurried note to a longtime assistant, but the responses were slow, often blocked by those who wanted to control her schedule or her image. She was attempting to send small, unheard cries into the chaotic Hollywood wind, but the noise was too great and the people who truly loved her were far away. Ella, who had recently concluded a series of spectacular sellout performances, found herself unable to enjoy the victory. She was thousands of miles away, but the distance felt like a physical agony. She began canceling meetings, pushing aside offers for interviews, and even turning down a lucrative recording session, all because she felt the frantic, unstoppable urge to call. Her manager, a practical, unflappable man named Norman, tried to reassure her. "Ella, baby, she's Marilyn Monroe. She's fine. She's just being dramatic again." But Ella knew the difference between drama and a soul that was slipping. She would retreat to her hotel room, the quiet broken only by the frantic dialing of the telephone. She knew the number by heart, a number she had only used a handful of times in 5 years. Ring. No answer. Ring. Busy signal. Ring. The phone just dropped into a desolate silence. With every failure to connect, the knot in Ella's chest tightened, a cold certainty that she was watching the window close. Her manager grew exasperated. He reminded her of their schedule, of the commitment she had to the music. "The world needs your voice, Ella. Stop worrying about a movie star who has a dozen people looking after her." But Norman didn't understand the invisible debt, the bond forged in the fires of shared struggle. Ella wasn't calling a celebrity. She was calling the only person in Hollywood who had seen Norma Jean, the frightened, kind girl, and protected her. Now that same woman needed an audience of one, and the Queen of Jazz was paralyzed by a dead phone line. The agonizing irony was not lost on Ella. Her voice, the greatest in the world, could fill a stadium, yet it couldn't travel across the ocean to pierce the solitude of one small house in Brentwood. She envisioned Marilyn trapped, unable to articulate the depth of her despair, surrounded by people who saw dollars instead of distress. The silence from that phone line wasn't just an unanswered call, it was a profound, eerie quiet where a legendary life was unraveling. The dread peaked on the night of August 3rd. Ella couldn't sleep. She sat by the phone, convinced that if she stopped dialing, she would lose her chance forever. She sent a desperate wire to a trusted contact in Los Angeles, begging them to check on her friend. Hours passed with no reply. Then, just as the European sun began to rise on August 4th, the phone rang, jarring the silent hotel room. It wasn't the contact, it was the operator patching through a long-distance call. And on the other end, thin, small, and profoundly weary, was the voice she had been terrified she would never hear again. The phone was ringing, but the silence had already done its terrible work. The simple sound of Marilyn's voice after days of agonizing silence should have brought relief. Instead, it brought a chill. It was barely a whisper, thin and colorless, stripped bare of the breathy glamour the world knew, sounding like the frail echo of a young girl lost far from home. Ella gripped the receiver, tears already starting, knowing instantly that the voice belonged to Norma Jean, not the indestructible star. "Marilyn, baby, where have you been? I've been trying to reach you. Are you okay? Tell me what's wrong." Ella's questions tumbled out, urgent and frantic, a desperate waterfall of concern. She heard Marilyn's sigh on the other end, a sound of profound weariness that carried all the burden of the past few years. It wasn't the sigh of frustration, it was the heavy exhale of surrender. "I'm sorry, Ella, I needed to hear your voice." Ella, who could silence a stadium with a single clear note, found her own voice thick with emotion. She shifted immediately from frustration to soul-soothing. She demanded to know why Marilyn hadn't called, reminding her of their powerful, unspoken pact. "You know you can call me anytime, day or night. I don't care about the producers or the press. I care about you," Ella began, frantically listing solutions, offering to charter a flight back to Los Angeles that very day, offering to take Marilyn away from the Hollywood scrutiny to a quiet place where she could just be. But Marilyn gently refused the immediate help. "No, please, don't fly back. You have your work, Ella. The world needs your music." The refusal was firm, but her reason was heartbreakingly simple. She only called because she needed the comfort of hearing Ella's distinctive, joyful laugh and the deep warmth of her sincerity one last time. It was a lifeline thrown out, not for rescue, but for a final tether to kindness. It was then, in that moment of devastating clarity, that Ella realized the terrifying truth. This was not a friendly check-in after a busy month. This was an emotional farewell. The script of the conversation was shifting from a hopeful intervention to a quiet, devastating goodbye. Marilyn was calling the one person who she believed saw her soul clearly before she retreated to a place no one could follow. Ella's heart broke. She dropped the rescue talk and leaned into the intimate, shared history. "Do you remember the Mocambo, Marilyn? That night, you made me feel visible when the whole world was pretending I wasn't there. You gave me a future. You don't owe me a thing, but you owe yourself a chance to fight." Marilyn simply sighed, the sound echoing across the miles. The admission was an emotional dagger. She was using Ella's voice as a temporary shield against the crushing weight of her own unhappiness. Ella realized her role now was not to save the star, but to comfort the friend, to fill this final, thin wire of communication with as much love as it could carry. She was performing a private concert for an audience of one, a concert of pure, powerful reassurance. The weight of that responsibility was immense, and the emotional burden of the unspoken farewell settled heavy in the heart of the Queen of Jazz. If this intimate look into the secret bonds of friendship touched your heart, hit that subscribe button. You need to stay, because the words she whispered next were the final, heartbreaking confession of her life. Ella took a deep breath, fighting the sudden urge to sob. She knew she had to keep Marilyn talking, keep her anchored to the line, because the next word spoken might be the most devastating confession of all. The voice that finally emerged from Marilyn was not the breathy, playful chime of the movie star, but the raw, unpolished sound of Norma Jean, a ghost whispering across the international telephone lines. It was a confession delivered without acting, without artifice, stripped of all the layers of glamour the world had forced upon her. "I'm just tired, Ella. So terribly tired of the performance." Marilyn's voice broke as she spoke, revealing the profound ache that fame could not mend. She confessed that the endless struggle to be Marilyn Monroe had completely overshadowed the simple need to be Norma Jean. She told Ella she was worn down by the constant expectation, the unending necessity of smiling, flirting, and dazzling, even when her soul was bruised and exhausted. It was a terrifying admission for a woman whose entire identity was built on being the world's desire. "Do you ever feel like you're just a pretty dress, Ella?" Marilyn asked, her voice cracking. "Like a beautiful, expensive thing that everyone wants to own, but no one wants to actually keep warm?" Ella's own eyes brimmed with tears as she listened to the raw honesty of her friend. She understood this loneliness intimately, the feeling of being celebrated for a talent while feeling entirely invisible as a person. Ella reminded Marilyn of that terrible night at the Mocambo 5 years prior. "When you sat in that front booth, Marilyn, you weren't an image. You were a shield. You gave me dignity. You didn't just open a door, baby. You made me feel like I belonged in the world." The star on the other end of the line was silent for a long moment, processing the gravity of that reminder. For Marilyn, whose deepest insecurity was the fear of being insignificant, Ella's words were a powerful, vital counter-argument. She had mattered. She had made a profound, lasting difference that had nothing to do with box office receipts or magazine covers. Yet, the despair was too deep. Marilyn returned to her central fear. "But you remember what I did. You don't remember me, Ella. Nobody ever just loved the girl who burned toast and read poetry." She confided that the constant scrutiny had eroded her sense of self, leaving her with the devastating realization that the only part of her the world valued was a creation, an illusion. She felt she had been reduced to a valuable commodity, exhausted and ready to be discarded. The two legends, one the sovereign of song and the other the queen of cinema, shared a moment of devastating vulnerability, talking about the high price of fame and the profound isolation that came with it. Ella knew she couldn't offer a cure, but she could offer her soul. "I know what it's like to be a trophy baby, but you were my mirror. When you stood up for me, you were fighting for your own right to be a woman, not just a beautiful thing, and I love her." Ella insisted, her voice resonating with deep, powerful conviction, hoping the strength of her words could cross the distance. Marilyn simply sighed, the sound echoing across the miles. The confession was over, the darkest fear laid bare. Now Ella knew she had to shift her strategy. She had to use her ultimate weapon, the one thing that had the power to soothe the world's pain, and now perhaps her friends as well. The air between Paris and Brentwood suddenly felt thick with unresolved grief. Ella knew that words had failed, that the emotional wound was too deep for logic. There was only one thing left to offer the lost soul on the other end of the line. Words had failed. Confession had offered relief, but not rescue. In that heavy silence hanging over the transatlantic line, Ella Fitzgerald knew exactly what she had to do. She would use the one thing Marilyn had risked her career to protect, her voice, to soothe the desperate spirit on the other end. Softly, tenderly, Ella began to sing. Not a big, powerful standard, but a gentle, familiar lullaby. The kind of tune a mother might sing to an infant in the quiet hours before dawn. Marilyn, who had just confessed her profound emptiness, listened. The song wasn't about fame, nor jazz, nor the stage. It was pure, simple melody, a sound that spoke of home and safety. On the other side of the world, Ella focused every ounce of her majestic talent into that tiny receiver, creating a private oral sanctuary for her friend. And as the gentle melody unfolded, Marilyn's breathing, which had been shallow and ragged during the confession, began to slow. For the first time in what felt like months, the crushing anxiety lifted, replaced by the profound comfort of being sung to by someone who truly loved her. As the song faded, a fragile memory surfaced in Marilyn's voice. She mentioned a small, quiet dream she'd held on to since childhood, not walking the red carpet, but having a simple, normal kitchen. A kitchen with a checkered floor and morning sun where she could just drink coffee and watch the world go by. She spoke of the impossible yearning to simply be a wife or a mother, a feeling that felt so far removed from the golden cage of Hollywood that it seemed like a fantasy from another life. Ella's heart ached, recognizing the depth of that unfulfilled domestic yearning. She seized on the moment of calm, pouring all her resolve into a powerful promise. "I'm coming home, Marilyn. Today, I'm canceling the rest of the tour. We'll get you out of that house, away from those circling vultures. We'll go to a place in the mountains where nobody knows your name, where you can burn all the toast you want." She spoke with absolute certainty, determined to use her own considerable power to shield the fragile woman who had once shielded her. Then, Marilyn's voice returned, suddenly clear, decisive, and chillingly resolved. The small, hopeful lightness vanished. She had absorbed the lullaby, accepted the love, and now she was ready to close the curtain. She interrupted the singing with a sudden finality, her voice clear but chillingly resolved. "I need you to stop singing now, Ella. I need to go." It was the sound of a spirit finally making peace with its own exhaustion. The peace the song had brought was not for living, it was for leaving. The beautiful, brief song was over, and in the space where the melody had been, a profound chill took its place. Marilyn's voice, which had been soothed by the music, was now clear, steady, and terrifyingly resolved. It was the sound of a spirit finally making peace with its own exhaustion. Ella's immediate response was pure animal panic. "No, Marilyn, listen to me. Don't you dare hang up. Tell me why, baby. Why now?" She knew this was the point of no return. The desperation in Ella's voice was immense, a desperate, soulful cry across the ocean. She knew that any delay, any hesitation, would mean the line would break forever. She heard Marilyn take a slow, deep breath, a sound that conveyed both profound sadness and quiet dignity, like a curtain being drawn on a painful play. "It's okay, Ella. It's better this way." Marilyn's voice was the barest whisper, but it carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken heartbreaks. Ella pleaded, invoking the Mocambo, invoking Norma Jean, shouting promises of quiet, simple days. But Marilyn was no longer listening to rescue. She was delivering her final truth. She interrupted Ella's desperate stream of promises with a quiet, devastating finality. She needed to let go of the burden, the dazzling, impossible weight of the persona the world demanded. She wanted her memory, if it lasted at all, to be something simple and gentle, far removed from the headlines and the flashbulbs. She wanted her true self to finally rest. Then came the heartbreaking 12 words, the final confession whispered into the receiver, a message not for Ella's ears alone, but for the history books she hoped would forget her famous name. Ella froze, knowing the world was about to lose its greatest star, and she had just received her final confession. Marilyn's last request, faint and filled with sorrow, was, "Tell the world I was just a girl who wanted a quiet song." The words struck Ella with the force of a physical blow, not a cry for help, but a plea for authenticity. Marilyn wasn't asking for rescue, she was asking for understanding. She was asking for the world to see the girl who fought for Ella's music, not the star who courted scandal. Ella tried desperately to speak, to absorb the words and argue back, but she couldn't. Her voice caught in her throat, choked by the sudden, chilling resolution she heard in her friend's farewell. The line went silent. Ella did not hear a dial tone or a busy signal. She heard the sound of a connection being deliberately severed. She knew in that instant that the silence was absolute. Marilyn had made her choice, and the finality of that whisper was the soul-shaking truth. Ella was left holding the receiver, thousands of miles away, the keeper of a beautiful, tragic secret. The heartbreak of this whisper cuts across distance and time. What truth do you keep hidden beneath your public face? Drop a comment below. Tell us about a time you felt unseen, just like Norma Jean. Ella slammed the receiver down, the noise echoing deafeningly in the quiet Parisian hotel room. Her manager, sensing the shift from desperation to panic, rushed in, but it was too late. Ella knew with terrible certainty that she was holding the receiver that had just received Marilyn Monroe's final, heartbreaking goodbye. The line went silent. It was not the abrupt click of a disconnection, but a profound, heavy void, the sound of a soul withdrawing from the world. Ella Fitzgerald found herself staring at the telephone, the receiver still clutched tightly in her hand, uttering a small, guttural scream that was entirely lost to the vastness of the ocean separating her from Los Angeles. "Marilyn, Marilyn," she cried, shaking the receiver as if she could somehow jolt the woman back onto the line. The queen of jazz, whose voice was known for its flawless control, was reduced to a primal sound of terror and helplessness. She immediately began trying to call back, dialing the number again and again, each ring a hammer blow against her mounting panic. Busy. No answer. The circuit was closed, the connection gone. Her manager, Norman, burst into the room, alarmed by the noise. He found Ella weeping, her face streaked with tears, pushing the buttons of the telephone with frantic, trembling fingers. "It's Marilyn! Something terrible has happened on Norman. I just heard her say goodbye. I know it." Norman, pragmatic and grounded in the schedules and demands of the music industry, tried to physically pull the phone away from her. "Ella, stop. She is dramatic, you know this. She probably just took a sleeping aid and is finally resting. You are thousands of miles away. You can't control what happens there." He tried to soothe her, dismissing her fear as the overreaction of an exhausted emotional artist. But Ella refused to be comforted. "She didn't take aid, Norman. She found her final piece, and I heard it leave the line. You hear drama. I heard a soul making its departure." She fought him off, tears streaming down her face, insisting that the piece in Marilyn's final tone was a chilling, absolute resolution that spoke of finality, not sleep. She had been given a front row seat to her friend's farewell, and the devastating powerlessness of being unable to intervene was now consuming her. She had to rely on that desperate wire she sent earlier. She called her contact again, sobbing out the words, repeating the chilling final statement. "Tell the world I was just a girl who wanted a quiet song." She begged them to break through the security and check on Marilyn, demanding to know if anyone had heard anything, seen anything unusual. The hours that followed were an agonizing blur of helpless waiting. Ella, who had conquered every stage in the world, could only pace her small hotel room, trapped by the distance and the profound emptiness of the dead phone line. Her magnificent voice was silenced by grief, reduced to panicked sobs. She had been given the great gift of the Mocambo, and now she was left with the terrifying tragic burden of knowing her benefactor had left the world in profound sorrow. The helplessness of that distance was the worst part. The agonizing realization that the power of her music, the magnitude of her love, could not cross the great divide to offer a final saving embrace. She knew, even before the sun filled, rose over Paris, that her frantic calls would remain unanswered, and the eerie silence she had feared would soon be confirmed by the awful roar of the world's headlines. The fragile peace Ella had managed to find after her night of frantic calls was shattered by a sound more devastating than any alarm, the crackle of a foreign radio station reporting the early morning headlines from America. A producer, pale and shaken, quietly placed the small, folded newspaper in her hand. The headline, massive and stark, confirmed the profound sorrow that had been delivered over the phone line hours earlier. Marilyn Monroe, the world's brightest star, was gone in her Brentwood home. The news hit Ella not as a shock, but as a devastating validation. There was no disbelief, only an agonizing confirmation of the chilling finality she had heard in that whispered farewell. The public was stunned, reacting with a mixture of shock, gossip, and rampant speculation. But Ella's grief was private, sacred, and entirely centered on the words, "Tell the world I was just a girl who wanted a quiet song." Immediately, the public spectacle began. The headlines were lurid, focusing on investigations, political ties, and the scandalous aspects of the Hollywood tragedy. The focus was on Marilyn Monroe, the symbol, the woman who entertained presidents and filled theaters. Nobody, it seemed, cared about the fragile soul who craved a quiet kitchen and burned toast. The world was consumed by the spectacle, the noise, the endless grinding machine of fame she had confessed was crushing her. Ella, meanwhile, refused to comment. Her manager, sensing the commercial opportunity in having the Queen of Jazz speak about her famous friend, pressed her to issue a public statement, perhaps even a tearful tribute. But Ella staunchly refused. "They are mourning a fantasy," she told Norman, her voice quiet but firm. "I am mourning a friend. The world doesn't get to hear her real story from me, not now." She understood that the moment she spoke, her words would be swallowed by the tabloid frenzy, obscuring the delicate, heartbreaking truth of that final phone call. She kept their friendship and Marilyn's last plea locked tight in her heart, a silent, powerful promise to honor Norma Jean, not the legend. The contrast between the loud public tragedy and Ella's quiet, private devastation was immense. While the cameras focused on the house and the crowds, Ella wept for the promise of the quiet song that would never be sung. She mourned the life that had been so relentlessly public that it had robbed the woman of the ability to simply breathe. The debt she owed Marilyn suddenly felt heavier than ever, transformed from gratitude for a career into a sacred responsibility for a memory. Ella knew the world would quickly forget the human being behind the celebrity. But she, the woman who was saved by Marilyn's immense compassion, would never forget the simple, tragic plea of her last whisper. The music would go on, but for Ella, the melody would forever be shadowed by the sound of that profound, final loneliness. This beautiful story reminds us that true friendship is often a quiet shield against the loudest chaos. Share this story with someone who needs a reminder that the person behind the public face is what truly matters. Ella packed her bags, her European tour suddenly over. She had to return to Los Angeles, not to attend the funeral, but to begin the quiet, lifelong task of keeping the truth of Marilyn's final, heartbreaking whisper alive. Ella Fitzgerald did not attend the massive public spectacle of Marilyn Monroe's funeral. While the press and the cameras jockeyed for position outside the cemetery, Ella was standing quietly backstage in a Los Angeles auditorium, the empty silence before the curtain rose feeling heavier than any final curtain call. She was preparing for her first performance since the awful August morning, and before she could face the audience, she had a private memorial to conduct, an act of silent devotion just for Norma Jean. For 1 full year, Ella refused to sing the jazz standard that Marilyn had loved the most. The song, which Marilyn had requested countless times during the Mocambo performances, became a silent marker of her grief, a song too sacred and too sad to be delivered to a crowd. It was her quiet penance, her way of ensuring the public knew nothing of the profound wound in her heart. The legal arrangements following Marilyn's sudden departure brought an unexpected, profound closure. When the will was read and the small personal bequests were delivered, Ella was stunned to learn she had been left a tiny private memento. It was not a piece of jewelry or a film reel, but a personal book of poetry, well-worn, dog-eared, with certain lines underlined in a familiar, hesitant hand. Attached was a small, handwritten card that simply read, "For the quiet song, N.J." This gift, worth nothing to the world but everything to Ella, was the ultimate confirmation that Marilyn had indeed seen her. The star had spent her final hours thinking of the friend who had saved her career, delivering a final nod to their shared understanding of the inner life. Marilyn had ensured that a piece of her true intellectual self, the part that loved literature and quiet contemplation, went to the only person she felt was worthy of keeping it secret. Ella pressed the book against her heart, realizing that the debt of the Mocambo was not simply repaid, it had been transfigured into a sacred trust. Marilyn hadn't wanted fame, she had wanted recognition of her soul. And in this small, dusty book of poems, Ella saw the affirmation. Marilyn knew that Ella would see past the glamour to the yearning girl beneath. This secret memorial became Ella's shield against the noise of Hollywood. When reporters tried to pry, she would simply mention the power of the Mocambo, never the intimacy of the phone call or the meaning of the book. She carried the quiet sorrow of that last whisper into every performance, letting the emotional weight of that profound loss add an invisible, soulful depth to her music. The world never connected the two events. The Queen of Jazz's sudden, somber shift in her repertoire and the movie icon's tragic departure. But for Ella, every note she sang after August 1962 was dedicated to the fragile soul who craved simplicity. The public knew Marilyn was gone, but only Ella truly knew why, and only Ella held the simple final proof of her friend's hidden humanity. The book of poems remained on Ella's bedside table for the rest of her life, a silent testament to a promise made across an ocean. Ella guarded her secret fiercely, waiting for the right moment, the perfect opportunity to finally tell the world the truth about the 12 heartbroken words she had been entrusted with. The greatest secret in jazz history, the secret Ella Fitzgerald carried in her soul for 30 years, was finally about to be revealed. When the journalist asked about the Mocambo, Ella leaned in, and the true meaning of Marilyn's final, heartbreaking whisper came to light. Ella Fitzgerald, now frail and resting, sat in a quiet, sunlit room, speaking to a young journalist about her legendary career. When the reporter innocently brought up the Mocambo story, praising Marilyn's advocacy, Ella nodded slowly, a profound sorrow clouding her eyes. This was the moment she had been waiting for. "People talk about the Mocambo debt like it was a favor I owed her," Ella said, her voice soft but imbued with the deep resonance of memory. "But the debt was paid back many times over in August of 1962. She then spoke, carefully and for the first time, about the last telephone call. She didn't reveal the exact date or the location, protecting the raw edges of the memory, but she revealed the emotional truth of the conversation. She described hearing her friend's spirit withdrawing and the agonizing finality of the 12 words. Ella explained that the sound of Marilyn's final whisper was the saddest sound she ever heard, but also the most honest. It was a request, she told the reporter, not for rescue, but for recognition. It was her final, desperate plea to be seen as Norma Jean, the vulnerable girl who simply wanted peace, rather than the relentless projection of Marilyn Monroe, the Hollywood fantasy. The moral lesson, the cathartic payoff that Ella had carried for so long, finally unfurled. Marilyn's whisper wasn't about the tragedy of an ending, it was about the tragedy of living without being truly seen. She had used her last moment of connection not to express fear, but to define her legacy on her own terms. The true kindness Marilyn showed Ella was not just opening the door at the Mocambo, it was giving Ella the sacred trust of her final, simple truth. Ella concluded that the legacy of their unique friendship wasn't celebrity helping celebrity, but two women recognizing each other's profound inner struggle. Marilyn's actions at the Mocambo were driven by her own deep yearning to be valued, a yearning she recognized in Ella. And in return, Ella used her decades of fame not to sensationalize a friend's departure, but to quietly affirm her humanity. The queen of jazz looked out the window, her mind far away, perhaps back in that small Brentwood house on the tragic night. She smiled slightly, a sad, sentimental expression. "She wanted a quiet song," Ella whispered, repeating the words that had haunted her career. "And that's what I gave her. Not a stage performance, but a lifetime of keeping her simple, beautiful truth. The fame, the success, the awards, all of it faded compared to that one, sacred promise made across a static phone line. The profound sorrow of the story was transformed into the bittersweet beauty of authentic friendship, a legacy defined not by a star's blinding light, but by a quiet, heartbreaking whisper. If this intimate look at their secret bond touched your heart, please leave a like to honor their friendship. And subscribe to our channel so you never miss another untold story about the quiet human moments behind Hollywood's biggest legends.